The great hall of the Nightshade Pack smelled of roasted meat and old stone, a scent seeped into the walls by centuries of feasts and violence. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting shadows across the painted faces of ancient alphas whose eyes seemed to judge all below. The space held 300 pack members at long oak tables laden with roasted venison, glazed chicken, golden root vegetables, and goblets of wine the color of dried blood. Everything was arranged with meticulous precision, designed to display power and control. The Nightshade Pack wanted the Alpha King to understand they were civilized, orderly, following the old laws. This feast was meant to be a masterclass in compliance and hierarchy. Elder Corvus Nightshade sat at the high table, draped in black robes trimmed with crimson silk, wolf-fang clasps glowing at his throat. His gnarled blackthorn staff with its iron wolf skull leaned against his chair. His thin-lipped smile was all hospitality, refined through decades of interaction with powerful men, conveying warmth while concealing calculation. The Alpha King Fenris Ravenspire was not the sort of man who gave the impression of wanting for anything. He sat at the high table like he was carved from stone and darkness itself, his long black hair falling past his shoulders in loose waves that suggested he had given the matter of grooming only the minimal necessary attention. His gray eyes, steel-colored and cut like a predator's, took in every detail of the hall with the cold precision of a warrior assessing a battlefield, cataloging weaknesses and points of vulnerability, reading the text of the feast, the way a scholar might read a book written in a language he had studied long ago. The silver chain of office hung across his broad chest, bearing the sigils of his authority. A raven and a wolf intertwined, the ancient symbols of the great kings who had ruled the territories since the time of the first moon bond, when the great alphas had first understood that power was not its own justification, but something that could be wielded toward purpose. His black leather coat was unmarked by dust or wrinkle, despite the 2 days of hard riding that had brought him to the Nightshade compound. His movements were economical and controlled, each gesture weighted with the kind of power that didn't need to shout, that didn't need to prove itself through excess or display. When he reached for his goblet, each motion was precise. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, and people listened, not because of fear exactly, though fear was certainly present, but because the quiet was always more dangerous than any roar. Roars could be predicted. Roars announced themselves and gave you time to prepare. But quiet could hide anything. Quiet could contain depths. "You maintain impressive order here, Elder," he said, lifting his goblet to his lips, his steel-gray eyes never leaving Corvus's thin face. The gold ring around his iris, that telltale mark of an alpha whose wolf was close enough to the surface to influence his appearance, caught the torchlight and glowed for just a moment like something burning. "Your pack seems to understand discipline, to comprehend the necessity of structure." Elder Corvus inclined his head with the practiced obsequiousness of a man who had spent decades learning how to bow before power without ever fully submitting to it. His thin-lipped smile widened slightly. "The old laws have served the Nightshade Pack well for more generations than I have lived, my king," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "We believe in structure, in hierarchy, in each member understanding their place and fulfilling their purpose with devotion that borders on the sacred. It is the natural order, the strong at the apex where they guide and command, the weak at the foundation where they support and serve, all working in perfect harmony for the good of the whole. This is not cruelty, my king. This is wisdom." Fenris set down his goblet with precise care, the motion slow and deliberate, the kind of motion that drew attention without seeming to demand it. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a quality that made the nearest pack members lean slightly back in their chairs, as if responding to some instinctual understanding of danger. "Hierarchy and slavery are not the same thing, Elder," he said quietly. "I would hope the Nightshade Pack understands the distinction because the distinction is a considerable one, and the failure to understand it has been the downfall of packs more powerful than yours." A small muscle tightened at the corner of Corvus's mouth, but his smile never wavered. "Of course not, my king. We have no slaves. We have bondservants, those born with the Omega designation, bound by the ancient law that predates even the great packs, called to serve not through coercion, but through the very nature of their birth. It is written in the oldest scrolls. It is tradition so old, it has the quality of law. The Omegas understand this. They are content in their role." Before Fenris could respond, before he could turn those cutting gray eyes further onto the Elder's claims and begin the process of dismantling them through conversation, The massive doors to the kitchens at the far end of the hall swung open. A line of servants emerged, each one moving with the practiced precision of individuals who had rehearsed this entrance many times. They were thin, all of them, despite the abundance of food in the hall, a testament to the hierarchy that Corvus claimed was so natural. Their clothing was rough-spun and serviceable, stained with the evidence of hard use, made from materials that were clearly the cheapest available, suggesting that even their garments were meant to mark them as separate from the rest of the pack. And all of them, without exception, wore iron chains. The chains caught at Fenris's attention with the intensity of a wolf's focus on prey. His eyes, which had been tracking Corvus with the kind of attention that suggested he was mentally cataloging everything the elder said for future reference, shifted to fix on the metal bonds that connected wrist to wrist that marked each servant as the property of the pack. The golden ring around his iris expanded slightly, and for a moment it seemed as though the wolf beneath his human skin was pressing closer to the surface, pulled toward the site of these restraints the way iron was drawn toward a lodestone. His fingers went very still on the table in front of him. The servants moved in practiced silence, their footfalls nearly soundless on the stone floor despite the chains, a skill that spoke to endless practice, to hours spent learning how to move in a way that didn't draw attention, that didn't disturb the carefully maintained peace of the hall. They carried platters of delicate pastries glazed with honey and studded with nuts that looked like they had taken hours to prepare. Small works of art designed to demonstrate that even the lowest members of the pack could be trained to produce beauty. They moved from table to table, setting down the pastries with careful ceremony, then turning to move away with the same silent efficiency. Elowen Ashwood emerged last from the kitchen doorway, and she was not carrying a tray of pastries, but a silver pitcher of wine, heavy enough that she had to hold it with both hands to keep it steady. She had learned, over 7 years of servitude in the Nightshade compound, to move like shadow and silence, to be present in a space without truly being seen, to make herself as small and unobtrusive as her body would allow. Her long auburn hair, a color that in another context might have been described as beautiful, was bound tightly at the nape of her neck with rough cord, kept out of the way so it wouldn't risk falling into the food, so it couldn't cause any disruption. Her warm amber eyes, flecked with gold, in a way that suggested she might have had some stronger wolf heritage, were fixed on the floor 6 feet ahead of her, a safe distance that allowed her to navigate the treacherous terrain of the hall without making eye contact with any of the alphas gathered at the tables above her in the feast. The iron shackles on her wrists were well made, clearly the product of a craftsman with long experience in making functional bonds that would last for years under constant wear. She had developed a particular way of holding her hands that kept the chain connecting the shackles from clinking audibly with every step, a skill she had perfected through countless repetitions. It was not a skill she had learned through instruction, but something she had developed through trial and error, through nights of practice in her small cell off the kitchens, through the brutal feedback of pain when she failed to keep the chains silent during service. She had worn these chains since she was 17 years old. She was 24 now. 7 years of servitude stretched behind her like a road she had been forced to walk at gunpoint. 7 years of learning to anticipate needs before they were spoken aloud. 7 years of accepting punishment for infractions both real and imagined. She had been whipped for spilling a single drop of wine onto a white tablecloth, a mark that could not be hidden, that served as evidence of her carelessness and required correction. She had been struck across the face for looking an alpha directly in the eye, for a momentary lapse in discipline that had taken weeks of careful compliance to undo. She had learned, through 100 small brutalities and a dozen large ones, the precise parameters of her existence. Keep your head down, move quietly, obey without question, expect nothing, hope for even less, survive. The scar along her left collarbone was a thin, pale line that ran from the base of her neck toward her shoulder, visible when her servant's dress shifted slightly as she moved. It was a memento of a whipping she had received at 19 for the unforgivable transgression of questioning a direct order. She had asked, in a moment of weakness or madness she had never quite understood, why the leftovers from the feast couldn't be given to the hungriest servants instead of being thrown out. The question had cost her 15 lashes with a leather belt, applied with precision and without mercy. The master of servants had known how to inflict pain in a way that would leave a lasting mark but wouldn't incapacitate. Punishment rather than crippling injury, though the distinction between the two was often unclear in practice. Elowen had learned not to scream, not because she was naturally strong, but because screaming only seemed to inflame the anger of those doing the beating, and she had discovered that silence was its own kind of survival strategy. If she didn't scream, if she didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain reflected in sound, perhaps they might lose interest more quickly. This theory had been tested and refined through experience, and she had become quite good at pain by the time she was 20. Tucked inside the hem of her servant's dress, sewn into the rough fabric with stitches so small and careful that no one had ever found it, despite occasional inspections, was a single pressed wildflower. It was dried and flat now, nearly transparent in the way that dried flowers became. The delicate purple petals faded to a color that suggested dried blood or old bruises, a visual metaphor for what survival had done to her. She had picked it the day before she was dragged away from her home at 17. A tiny lavender bloom growing between the cobblestones in the market square, where her mother had taken her to trade cloth that had been woven in the small loom they kept behind their cottage. It had been the last thing she had voluntarily chosen to pick, the last piece of the outside world she had held in her hands before her life became nothing but stone walls and routine and pain and the constant, grinding weight of servitude. She kept the wildflower the way other people might keep a prayer or a religious relic. It was proof, in some small but crucial way, that she had once existed as something other than a servant, that she had been capable of stopping to notice beauty, that she had been free once, if only for 17 years. The memory of that 17-year-old girl who had seen a purple flower and thought it was worth picking seemed to come from another lifetime entirely, and yet the girl lived in her still, dormant, but not dead, waiting for circumstances that would allow her to breathe again. Now she approached the high table with her eyes fixed on the floor, her pitcher raised to precisely the right height, her movements economical and practiced to the point of automaticity. She would refill the goblets. She would perform this task perfectly, without spillage, without error, without drawing any attention whatsoever. She would do it the way she had done it hundreds of times before, and then she would disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. This was her world. This had always been her world. And she had learned, through a long process of painful education, to accept that the world would not change, that she would not change, that the shape of her life had been determined by forces beyond her influence or control when she was far too young to protest. Then she stepped into the space directly beside Fenris Ravenspire's chair to pour his wine, and everything shattered. The mate bond ignited like lightning trapped inside flesh, like the sun suddenly condensing itself inside her chest. It started in Elowen's heart, a sudden violent recognition that seemed to split her sternum open and flood her entire body with light that was both golden and white, and more real than anything physical. Everything she had been, every carefully built wall, every practiced invisibility, every small death she had accepted as the price of survival, every compromise she had made with her own consciousness to keep herself functional, seemed to burn away in an instant. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, overwhelming her senses to the point where she could barely process what was happening. She gasped, her lungs suddenly unable to remember how to work properly. Her hand spasmed, and the silver pitcher in her grip lurched suddenly sideways. Wine sloshed from the pitcher, creating a stain of dark red across the white tablecloth in front of the Alpha King, a mark visible to everyone of her failure, of her disruption of the perfect order that had been so carefully maintained. For Fenris, the bond landed like the sudden recovery of a memory so profound that it seemed to rewrite reality. His wolf, which had been prowling beneath his skin with the coiled attention it always carried when dealing with pack politics, the complex negotiations that came with ruling over multiple territories, suddenly went very still. And then it surged forward with a force that threatened to overwhelm his human consciousness entirely. The sensation was of pure certainty, a knowing that transcended all language and logic, a fundamental understanding that rewrote every instinct he possessed. Mate. This one. This fragile woman with her head bowed, with her eyes on the ground, with her servant's dress and her chains and her visible scars. This was the woman his wolf had been waiting for, the woman his very cells had been yearning toward without his conscious knowledge, the one person in all the territories who was supposed to be his. His eyes flooded with gold, the transformation visible and unmistakable. The amber ring around his iris, usually a subtle marker of his alpha nature, blazed like molten metal poured fresh from a forge, burned with an intensity that seemed to light up his entire face. For a moment, he could not remember how to breathe, could not remember anything about protocol or propriety, or the kind of restraint expected of an Alpha King in a formal setting. The wolf in him wanted to claim her, to mark her, to bind her to him with teeth and magic, and the kind of bonding magic that would make clear to every single person in this hall, and beyond that, she belonged to him, that she was his. that any further attempts to chain her would result in swift and terrible consequences. The entire hall saw it. Hundreds of eyes, suddenly alert despite the wine and the food and the drowsy comfort of a full belly, turned to watch the impossible spectacle. The Alpha King's eyes gone solid gold, the woman servant frozen mid-motion with the pitcher still in her trembling hands, a connection of light visible in the air between them, crackling like static electricity made manifest. The mate bond was not subtle when it was recognized and accepted. It was not a quiet thing that could be ignored or pretended away. It was the most ancient magic that the shifter world possessed, older than the pacts, older than the laws, older than anything Corvus Nightshade could command or control or rationalize. It was proof, written in light and biology and the fundamental magic that bound shifters to the earth and to each other, that some things transcended all hierarchy, all law, all carefully constructed systems of control. Silence fell across the great hall like snow falling on a frozen lake, sudden, complete, and absolute. Forks were set down slowly on the rims of plates. Conversations died mid-word, the speakers suddenly aware that they were saying nothing that mattered. Every single pack member present seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, understanding at some primal level that a line had been crossed, that the carefully maintained order of the feast had been shattered by something more powerful than tradition or law. Fenris's eyes moved slowly downward, traveling along the length of Elowen's arm to the chains on her wrists, following the iron bonds with the kind of intensity that suggested he was seeing them for the first time, registering their existence as a violation of something sacred. The golden light in his eyes flared even brighter, expanding until it seemed to consume the gray entirely. When his gaze returned to Corvus, there was something deadly in the cold steel that surrounded that golden core, something that made even the elder of the Nightshade Pack, a man who had spent decades cultivating authority and command, lean back slightly in his chair as if responding to some instinctual understanding of predatory danger. "Remove her chains," Fenris said, his voice quiet and level, the kind of quiet that somehow carried more weight than any shout could muster. It was not a request. It was not even phrased as an option. It was the absolute command of absolute authority, backed by the weight of a mate bond that had just been recognized in front of 300 witnesses and could not be denied or explained away. Corvus's thin lips pressed into a line so tight they nearly disappeared. "My king," he said, and his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that came from watching one's carefully constructed world begin to crumble. "I must protest, most strongly. The woman is pack property. She is bound by ancient law to serve the Nightshade Pack until her death or the pack's dissolution. This is written in the oldest scrolls. Her status is not in question. I cannot simply... I am aware of what laws you claim govern this pack," Fenris interrupted, his voice still quiet, still controlled, but now carrying an edge that seemed to cut through the air like a blade. "I am the Alpha King, precisely because my authority supersedes the laws of individual packs when those laws have become corruptions of the old ways, when they have been twisted to justify cruelty instead of serving the protection and welfare of pack members. Slavery is not law, it is not tradition, it is not the natural order, it is cruelty dressed up in language ancient enough to seem respectable, adorned with justifications that have been refined over generations until they sound like truth. The woman standing before me is my mate. She is under my protection, and her chains will be removed. Now." No one moved. No one dared. The weight of the Alpha King's authority, now merged with the primal magic of the recognized mate bond, was enough to paralyze every person in the hall with the understanding that disobedience was not an option. So Fenris stood, his movements controlled and economical, but there was violence in them, the way there was violence in a sword drawn from its sheath. Not aggressive, not unwarranted, but absolutely present and undeniable. He walked down from the high table himself, his steps deliberate and measured, each footfall echoing through the hall like a drumbeat counting down to inevitability. Elowen watched him come, her eyes now raised from the floor, and terror and confusion warred in her chest with something else, something unnamed that her body recognized, even if her mind could not fully comprehend it. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't understand why the Alpha King was looking at her with those burning golden eyes. She didn't understand what the connection of light meant, except that it had broken something fundamental in the world. She knew only that she was terrified, that her heart was beating so hard she thought her ribs might crack, that the iron shackles on her wrists suddenly felt like they were burning against her skin. When Fenris reached her, he stopped a respectful distance away. Even in his fury, even with his wolf screaming for him to claim her, to mark her, to bind her to him with teeth and magic and the kind of bonding that would make clear to every single person in this hall, and beyond that, she belonged to him, that she was his, that any further attempts to chain her would result in swift and terrible consequences. He forced his wolf back into submission. This woman had survived 7 years of bondage. She did not need to be overwhelmed by another predator crowding her space. She did not need her freedom purchased at the cost of losing her autonomy to someone else. "May I?" he asked softly, extending his hand toward the chains on her wrists. His voice, when it was gentle, was almost more frightening than when it had cut like ice through Corvus's justifications. It was gentle, and it was powerful, and it was asking, actually asking, for permission to touch her. "I will not hurt you. I promise you that. I will never hurt you." Elowen stared at his hand. She had been trained, through 7 years of relentless instruction, never to meet the eyes of an alpha, never to accept anything offered without explicit permission from her masters, never to question or resist any authority. She had learned her place with the kind of thorough brutality that guaranteed compliance. It was so far outside the boundaries of her existence to accept mercy from the Alpha King that the very concept seemed impossible. But she was trembling, and the trembling was beyond her control, and when she slowly extended her wrists, she could not have said whether it was because some hidden part of her trusted this man, or simply because some primal part of her, some wolf instinct that had been beaten nearly to death but not quite extinguished, recognized him as something that could not be refused. It recognized him as home, as belonging, as the answer to a question she had been asking without knowing how to ask it. Fenris's fingers closed gently around the iron shackles, and for just a moment, he didn't move, simply held her wrists with the kind of care he might use with something precious and fragile, something that could break if handled without consideration. She could feel the gentleness in his grip, the deliberate control he was exercising, the power he was choosing not to use. Then he drew in a breath, and the wolf came partially to the surface. Not a full shift, but a partial transformation that brought forth enough of his animal strength and transformation magic to bend the iron. The sound of metal groaning under pressure filled the hall, echoing upward toward the painted faces of the ancient alphas, as if even they were bearing witness to this moment of transformation. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, like something ancient shattering and being reborn at the same moment, the chains snapped. The shackles fell away, clattering to the stone floor, with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence, bouncing once and then lying still. Elowen's wrists fell free. For the first time in 7 years, her hands were unbound. She stared at them as if they belonged to someone else, as if she didn't quite recognize what it meant to exist without that weight pulling her down, without the constant reminder of her bondage. Her skin was white where the iron had pressed, marked with deep grooves from years of wear, but beneath the marks was just skin, just wrists, just the ordinary, extraordinary architecture of freedom. She nearly fell. Her knees went soft, threatening to give way entirely, and her vision seemed to narrow to a pinpoint, darkness encroaching on the edges of her sight. Fenris caught her elbow with one large hand, supporting her weight without pulling her closer, maintaining that crucial space of respect even as her body threatened to betray her, even as every nerve in her body screamed for her to collapse. "You are safe now," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that seemed to reach past her fear and speak directly to something deep in her consciousness. "Under my protection, under the authority of the Alpha King, the Nightshade Pack will not touch you again. No one will hurt you again, not while I draw breath." "She is the Pack's property." Corvus had risen from his seat, his voice sharp with the kind of desperation that came from watching his authority crumble in real time, from realizing that the system he had spent his entire life constructing and maintaining was collapsing before his eyes. "You cannot simply remove a bondservant from the Pack without compensation, without proper legal proceedings, without—" "I can," Fenris said calmly without raising his voice, turning his head only fractionally to address the elder. "And I have. The woman is no longer the Nightshade Pack's concern. She is my mate, and she has chosen my protection. This matter is settled. It is not open to negotiation or debate or further legal interpretation." "She cannot choose anything," Corvus spat, his voice trembling with rage. "She is legally bound by ancient law to serve the Pack until—" Fenris turned his head more fully, and the motion was so small it might have been missed by anyone not watching closely. But Elowen felt it like a physical force, a shifting in the balance of power that seemed to affect the very air in the hall. his eyes, still burning with that molten gold, fixed on the elder with a kind of intensity that seemed to drain all the color from Corvus's face, that made him seem suddenly older, suddenly diminished, suddenly aware of how little his authority actually meant in the face of the Alpha King's will. "You will speak to me of the law, Elder Nightshade," Fenris said, his voice quiet but carrying an undertone of something ancient and terrible. "And we will discuss how you have interpreted these ancient traditions to justify slavery and abuse. We will discuss the flogging marks I see on the arms of your servants and the fear in their eyes. We will discuss whether your pack is fit to govern under the authority of the crown, whether your interpretation of the old laws is truly in keeping with their spirit, or if you have twisted them to serve your own hunger for power. But you will do this at court, with legal counsel present, where your defenses and your justifications can be properly examined by minds less biased than your own. For now you will step back, and you will accept the will of the Alpha King. Do I make myself clear?" Corvus was pale now, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. He bowed stiffly, the motion jerky with barely contained rage, the kind of rage that came from losing everything and understanding that there was nothing he could do about it. "As the king commands," he said, and the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. "Good," Fenris said, and then he turned his attention back to Elowen, his expression transforming entirely. The coldness that had characterized his confrontation with Corvus melted away, replaced by something infinitely more gentle, more patient, more aware of her fragility. "Come. We are leaving this place. My fortress is 2 days' ride north. You will come with me, and I will ensure you are never chained again." He released her elbow but held out his hand, an offer rather than a command. It was such a small gesture, such a simple thing, but for Elowen it was revolutionary. He was offering, he was asking. In all of her 24 years, no one had ever offered her a choice and meant it. She stared at his hand, and for the first time in 7 years, she was confronted with the possibility of actual agency, of having to make a decision that was hers alone to make, based on nothing but her own judgment and her own desires. She could refuse. She could stay with the pack, return to the kitchens, accept the chains that would surely be replaced immediately now that she had been seen by the Alpha King, marked by the mate bond. The pack would find a way to justify it, to claim that she had been coerced by the king, that she was still theirs, that the chains were for her own good. Or she could take the hand of this burning-eyed stranger who smelled like pine and leather and raw power, who had broken her chains with bare hands and claimed her in front of 300 people, and trust that freedom was real and not simply another kind of trap, another way of being bound. She thought of the wildflower pressed into the hem of her dress, that dried and fragile thing that held within it the memory of being 17 and free. She thought of the market square where she had picked it, the smell of the cloth traders, the sound of her mother's voice calling her name. She thought of having had a mother and a name that meant something beyond bondservant and choices that were hers alone to make. She thought of all the ways that 7 years had taken from her and all the ways that refusing this offer would mean accepting that they had been right, that the bondage was natural, that she didn't deserve freedom. She took his hand. "If you are watching Wolf-born Tales because you believe that true strength is not dominance but the power to choose, that an Omega survival is not weakness but the fiercest kind of courage, that a bond built on respect and freely given consent is stronger than any claim of power, then please subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Join our community of listeners who believe that love is not something to be claimed but something to be chosen, that the most sacred bonds are the ones where both partners are genuinely free to walk away and choose instead to stay. Because that kind of freedom, that kind of trust is what creates lasting connection. Subscribe to Wolf-born Tales and be part of a community that understands that true strength is not dominance, but the courage to choose, day after day, to stay. The fortress of Ravenspire rose from the mountainside, like stone and ancient magic, its towers reaching toward the sky. The walls were gray and imposing, but designed to protect rather than intimidate. Elowen had never been in a carriage before. Fenris arranged a proper carriage with suspension and cushioned seating, placing her inside carefully before sitting across from her. She watched through the windows as the Nightshade compound disappeared, knowing she would never return. With each turn of the wheels, something in her chest opened. For 2 days they traveled. Fenris kept his distance at night, sleeping outside her tent, giving her space to rest. He brought her meals and asked how she was feeling, treating her as if her comfort mattered. These courtesies seemed to belong to a different universe than the one she had inhabited for 7 years. Her voice emerged rusty from disuse, as if words had become something foreign. When they arrived at the fortress, she was lifted from the carriage with the same care shown in removing her chains. She was ushered through towering doors into a vast entrance hall, the ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. The light from tall windows was golden and soft, completely unlike the harsh torches of her servitude. She found herself frozen, unable to process the sheer scale of freedom. Lise, the fortress master, tall and broad-shouldered with steel-gray eyes, appeared. She surveyed Elowen with understanding, taking in the torn dress, white marks on her wrists, dirt beneath her fingernails, hollow cheeks that spoke of years of limited food, the flinch at sudden movements. "I'll draw you a bath," Lise said, her voice rough but kind. "Fenris has left instructions that you are to be treated as an honored guest. You'll sleep in the tower chambers. You'll be given real food and allowed to rest. And if you need anything, you need only ask." Elowen stared at her, unable to process. She didn't know how to ask for things. The concept of expressing a need that was hers alone seemed foreign and impossible. The idea of asking for something and having it provided simply because she had asked seemed like magic. The bath was the first warm water she had touched in 7 years. Lise filled a stone tub fitted with copper pipes, creating steam fragrant with lavender and rose. When Elowen removed her ragged dress, she held tight to the hidden wildflower sewn in the hem, preserving this small piece of her past self. When she lowered herself into the water, she wept, not from sadness alone, but from a breaking open of something sealed shut. The hot water washed away more than dirt. It washed away the perpetual scent of grease and servitude that had soaked into her skin. It washed away the surface layer of who she had learned to be, though it could not touch the deeper ways that 7 years of abuse had remade her. When she emerged, Lise gave her a soft linen shift and a warm wool dress in deep green that made her amber eyes glow. It was the first new garment she had received in years. The fabric was warm against her skin like kindness made tangible. The sleeves came to her wrists, covering the marks left by chains. That first night, she was shown to the tower chambers, a bedroom larger than any room she had occupied, with a bed so wide it seemed to stretch forever. She stood at the window watching the light fade from the sky, watching stars emerge one by one. The glass was clear enough to see distant peaks where snow still clung. She did not sleep. Fear kept her awake, not of immediate danger, but of the deeper terror of believing in something that might be taken away. If she slept, might she wake back in chains, punished for imagining she deserved better? The enslaved mind played tricks. She had seen it in the eyes of other servants, a dissociative state where freedom seemed impossible, a cruel fantasy. She sat in darkness, hands folded in her lap, trying to remember what it felt like to sleep without fear. In the morning, Fenris came to find her, knocking politely and waiting for permission to enter. No one had ever waited for her permission before. This courtesy alone seemed shocking. He carried a bundle of cloth, moving with deliberate slowness. When he unfolded it on her bed, she saw a gown, deep emerald velvet with gold thread embroidered at the bodice and sleeves, suggesting ivy growing around something precious. The kind of dress a lady might wear. "I thought you might like to dress more formally," he said. "You should wear something that reflects who you are, not who you were forced to be." "My lord, I cannot wear this," Elowen said, the refusal automatic. "This is far too fine for—" "It is yours," he said calmly. "You are not a servant here. You can be yourself, whatever that means. I know you don't know who you are anymore. That's all right. You can spend as much time as you need figuring it out." She didn't know who she was anymore. Before the chains, she had been a girl of 17, with a mother and a home and choices that mattered. She had been a servant for 7 years, and the servant was the only identity fully formed, fully automatic. The girl from before seemed like someone from a story she had read long ago, separated from her by more than just time. Over the following days and weeks, Fenris forced nothing. He gave her space, never crowded her, never demanded anything she wasn't ready to give. He ensured she had soft places to sleep, enough food, proper clothes, and space to simply exist. He sat across the dining hall during meals and asked what she liked to eat, what she had done before servitude, whether the chambers suited her, if there was anything she wanted to read. Most questions she couldn't answer, or answered in colorless ways. After so long training herself to have no preferences, no opinions, no inner life, she had to relearn how to access those things. It was like trying to read by an extinguished light covered with dust and cobwebs from years of disuse. Her mind would go blank when asked what she preferred. But gradually, over days and weeks, something shifted. She learned that saying, "I prefer the north-facing chambers for their light," brought no punishment. She learned that asking for tea meant it would be brought without her having to serve it first. She learned that her body belonged only to herself. This last lesson was hardest. 7 years of learning her body was a commodity could not be unlearned in weeks. Knowledge of her own autonomy had to be rebuilt piece by piece, every time Fenris respected her space and asked permission. One afternoon, she found him in the training grounds, a stone courtyard surrounded by high walls. He worked through sword forms with deliberate precision, shirtless in the spring sun, the silver chain of his office glinting as he moved. She watched from the shadow of a stone archway. She understood, for the first time, that his power was not dominance as she had been taught. It was not the power to break others, to make them smaller. The whippings she received were about dominance, proving superiority, establishing hierarchy. Fenris's power was control over himself, mastery of his own strength, the ability to be dangerous and choose not to be. It was the opposite of what she had learned. When he finished and turned to see her watching, he didn't seem surprised. The mate bond allowed him to sense her presence. He smiled, a small, gentle smile that made his scarred face seem almost boyish, and gestured for her to approach. "I was thinking of riding out to the spring fields," he said, breath slightly elevated. "They're particularly beautiful this time of year. Everything is coming back to life. Would you like to come?" She should have been afraid of being alone with him outside the fortress. But she was beginning to understand that the fortress itself was not the safety. The safety was in him, in his consistent refusal to hurt her, in his constant demonstration that she had choices. So she nodded, and he brought her a horse of her own. A dark gray mare with a gentle temperament and kind eyes that seemed to understand the rider was nervous and fragile. They rode out across rolling fields where wildflowers were just beginning to emerge from thawing earth, tender green shoots pushing up through soil. The fields stretched beneath the sky in waves of potential where nothing had yet grown, but the promise of growth was everywhere. The air smelled of earth and water, the sharp green smell of spring that carried renewal and transformation. They rode in comfortable silence, the sound of hooves on soft earth, creaking leather saddles, occasional bird calls. These were enough. Elowen found herself breathing more easily out here, away from the fortress's enclosed spaces. Something in the open air eased the tightness in her chest that had been present since the chains were placed on her wrists 7 years ago. Eventually, Fenris said, "I want to know your story. The truth. Who were you before the chains? What was your life like?" Elowen had to think for a long moment, riding through fields that seemed to stretch endlessly. The question itself seemed almost impossible to answer, not because she didn't know the truth, but because speaking it aloud would make it real, would confirm there had been a before, that the person she had been was no longer. "I had a mother," she said slowly, the words emerging like something dredged up from very deep water. "She was a weaver. We lived in the village on the eastern border of the Nightshade territories, in a cottage with a small loom behind it. She made cloth, simple cloth mostly, linen for tunics and wool for cloaks, but she was good at it. She had patterns, designs that she had created herself. Other weavers tried to copy her work, but never quite succeeded. She had a gift. We lived simply, but we were not unhappy. I remember the smell of the loom, the sound of the threads moving through her hands. I remember her singing while she worked. I was 17. She took me to market one day because she wanted to sell some of her cloth to a merchant who was passing through. There was a dispute with another weaver, a woman who claimed that my mother had stolen her patterns, though it was a lie. I knew it was a lie because I had watched my mother create those patterns from nothing, watched them emerge from her mind and her hands, watched the moment they became real. But the Alpha Enforcer took the other woman's word over my mother's. He didn't even look at our work, didn't ask for proof. He said that my mother would be punished, and I would be given to the pack as compensation for the shame and loss that the other woman had suffered. I tried to protest. I called out that it was unjust, and the enforcer looked at me as if I had struck him, as if my words were the greatest insult. That's when I understood that nothing I said would matter. She stopped speaking, her throat tight, and the silence stretched between them. Fenris didn't push, didn't demand more. He simply listened, which was its own kind of kindness, a form of respect that seemed almost foreign to her. "I never saw her again," she continued, the words coming slowly as if from very far away. "I don't know if she lived. I don't know if she found a way to escape, or if she was punished so severely that she couldn't recover. I think about her sometimes, wonder if she knew what happened to me, If she spent all these years wondering if I was alive, if I was being treated well. I think about the patterns she created and whether anyone will ever know that they came from her mind, that she was talented enough to deserve respect instead of having her work stolen. She pulled on her horse's reins, bringing them to a halt without quite meaning to. The movement was automatic, a response to emotion that her body had learned from years of practice hiding her feelings. Without planning to, without meaning to, she slipped off the horse and began walking through the field. The earth was soft beneath her feet. She was wearing proper boots now, not walking barefoot on stone, and she could feel the spring coming up from beneath the soil, life pushing up from the dark, insisting on growth despite everything that might work against it. Fenris dismounted and followed her, keeping back a respectful distance as she moved through the field. She was looking for something, though she might not have known it consciously. Her hands were stretched out at her sides, fingers brushing the emerging grass, and her amber eyes were searching the ground with the intensity of someone looking for something lost. Then she saw it, a clump of early wildflowers, small and delicate and purple, pushing up through the grass with the kind of determination that seemed impossible for something so fragile. They were the same color as the one she had picked 7 years ago, the same brave insistence on beauty and growth. Elowen knelt beside them without thinking, and she reached out her hand, and for the first time in 7 years, she touched living earth not as a servant preparing it for another's use, but simply as herself, as a woman who had once picked a flower for no reason other than the beauty of the thing and the desire to hold something beautiful in her hands. She wept, kneeling in the field, her fingers barely touching the petals. The tears came quietly, without sound, the kind of weeping that came from a place so deep it couldn't be forced or controlled. Not sadness, but a release of pressure that had been building for 7 years. The kind of tears that came from understanding that she had survived, that her spirit had not been broken, that some essential part of her had remained untouched despite everything done to her. Fenris did not come closer. He simply stood and watched, bearing witness to her grief and her healing, and the complicated way those two things were not separate but intertwined, one feeding the other, pain and growth existing in the same moment. She could feel his presence like a physical thing, steady and certain and completely patient. When she finally looked up at him, there were tears streaming down her face, and her amber eyes were bright with something that might have been hope, or might have been the first real breaking open of the cage she had built around herself to survive, the structures she had created to protect herself from further harm. The tears themselves were a kind of freedom. She was allowed to have emotions, to express pain and confusion and fear without being punished for them. "I don't know if I can stay with you," she said, her voice wavering with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can bond with you. I need to know that I can leave. I need to know that every moment I choose to stay is because I'm choosing it. Not because I'm bonded, not because I'm trapped again in a different kind of cage. I've been trapped so long. I don't know if I can trust that freedom is real." Fenris knelt down in the field beside her, careful to move slowly, careful to maintain that crucial distance. The earth beneath them was cool and slightly damp, smelling of growth and potential. "I know," he said, and the words carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "That's why I'm asking you to choose. Not now, not today, not until you're ready. Take whatever time you need. Learn who you are without chains. Learn who you are without fear, without the weight of servitude, without anyone expecting anything from you. Learn your own mind and your own heart. Test the boundaries of your freedom and understand that they are real, that no one will call you back, that the world does not collapse when you are not serving someone else's needs. And when you know that person, when she knows herself, then you can choose whether you want me, whether you want the bond, whether you want a life with me. That choice will be sacred to me because you will have made it freely. I can wait for that. I can wait as long as it takes. Your freedom is more important to me than claiming you." She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time, not at the power or the authority or the burning golden eyes, but at the man underneath. She saw the patience in him, the discipline of his restraint, the way his wolf was clearly chafing against his human decision to give her choice, the way the animal inside him wanted to claim her and bind her and make her his in ways that were primal and undeniable, but the way he held that control anyway, because respecting her autonomy was more important to him than claiming her, more central to who he was than the hunger of his wolf. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the moment that was enough. The rider came from the Nightshade Pack 5 weeks later, bearing a summons from Elder Corvus. His horse was lathered with sweat from hard riding, and his face bore the particular stress of a man who knew he was carrying a message that no one wanted to receive. He was admitted to the fortress by lease, and he was brought to the great hall where Fenris was conducting court, hearing disputes and grievances from the various pack territories under his rule. By rights in ancient law, Corvus claimed in the formal letter that the writer presented, the bondservant Elowen Ashwood was still pack property, regardless of her proximity to the Alpha King. She was a resource of the pack, a tool trained to serve a specific function, and the pack had suffered her absence. He was invoking the old laws to demand her return. If the Alpha King intended to keep her for whatsoever purpose he desired, he would need to stand before the Council of Elders and defend his position, submit to legal examination of the claims, allow the ancient laws to be tested in formal proceedings. It was exactly the kind of pressure Elowen had feared. The reaching back into the past, the attempt to drag her back into chains, the assertion that she was property to be disputed over, rather than a person with agency. She had felt herself begin to shrink at the news, had felt the familiar response that had kept her alive for 7 years. Compliance, acceptance of the inevitable, the belief that small people could not stand against large systems, that resistance was futile and would only bring pain. But Fenris had looked at her, and he had said, "You will appear before the Council of Elders, not because Corvus demands it, but because you will testify. You will speak your truth, you will not hide anymore, and I will stand beside you as witness and as your mate to ensure that the council hears you and that justice is served." "I cannot stand against the elder," she had said, the fear thick in her voice, her entire body trembling with the kind of anxiety that came from years of understanding that speaking out against authority resulted in punishment. "He has power, he has law on his side, he has nothing," Fenris had cut in quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that seemed to reach past her fear and speak directly to something deep in her consciousness. "He has only lies, and you have the truth. And I promise you, Elowen, the truth is stronger than any law written by men who wanted to justify cruelty." The council chambers were vast and cold, with high windows that let in a chill spring light, the kind of light that seemed to drain color from everything it touched. The Council of Elders stood in a semicircle, not seated, standing in the position of authority and judgment. And there were 5 of them representing the major packs of the territory. They were all old men, thin and gray and heavy with the weight of centuries of precedent, or what they understood to be centuries, traditions that had accrued so much authority through repetition that they seemed immutable, unchangeable, as fixed as the stones beneath their feet. Corvus stood at the center of the semicircle, his gnarled staff held upright before him like a scepter, his thin-lipped smile confident and commanding. He believed he was protected by law, by tradition, by the weight of how things had always been done, by the accumulated authority of generations of elders who had used similar arguments to control their packs. He had testified before a council many times, and his arguments had always carried the day. There was no reason to believe that this time would be different. Elowen stood before them in the emerald-green dress with gold thread, her wrists visible and unmarked except for the white lines that the chains had left, lines that were slowly fading as her body healed. Her hair was unbound and falling past her shoulders in auburn waves that caught the light from the windows. Fenris stood beside her, his presence a quiet statement of absolute support, the kind of presence that made it clear that he was not simply an observer but a participant in these proceedings, a guarantor of her safety and her right to be heard. But it was Elowen who spoke. She told them about being 17 and torn from her mother, the memory vivid and painful as a fresh wound. She told them about the branding, how they had heated the iron until it glowed orange and red, how she had smelled her own flesh burning, how the pain had been so intense that her vision had gone black at the edges. She showed them the marks on her wrist and her collarbone, faded now after 7 years but still visible, permanent reminders of the moment when she had ceased to be a person and become a commodity, marked with the stamp of ownership like cattle in a market. She told them about the kitchens and the endless labor, up before dawn to prepare food, standing on feet that ached, hands that became raw and then calloused from hot water and knives, working until the feast was finished and the last guest had left. She told them about the hunger that was always present, even among abundance, the paradox of preparing meals for others while being allowed only scraps, of preparing feasts while going to bed with an empty belly so often that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly full. She told them about being whipped for infractions real and imagined, about spilling wine and being struck across the back with a leather belt, the sound of it cracking against bone and muscle, about looking an alpha in the eye and having her face split open with the back of a hand, about asking a question and having her body marked with 50 lashes as punishment for her presumption in thinking she had the right to speak. She showed them her collarbone, the scar that ran along her skin like a permanent reminder. She told them about the other Omegas, some of whom had been worked to death, their bodies broken by labor and abuse until they simply ceased to function, were disposed of like broken tools, some of whom had been taken away for purposes they were never allowed to understand, and what happened to them was lost to mystery and rumor and the particular terror of the unknown. And she told them about survival, about learning to read from discarded papers that she found while cleaning, lists and correspondence and scraps of stories that she devoured in the darkness of her cell, using a stub of candle she had stolen, about memorizing the songs of the kitchen workers and singing them silently in her mind to maintain her own consciousness, her own identity separate from the role she was forced to play, about keeping a single pressed wildflower hidden in the hem of her dress as proof that she had once been free, that she could be free again, that the version of herself that existed before the chains was not dead but simply dormant, waiting for the moment when she could breathe again. The Nightshade Pack did not raise me, she said, her voice steady now, not breaking or wavering. They imprisoned me. They tried to convince me that imprisonment was my purpose, that servitude was my destiny, that the chains were for my own good, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. But I survived it, and I will not be returned to it. I will not be claimed as property by anyone. Not by the Nightshade Pack, not by anyone. The old laws that justified this were not laws at all. They were excuses created by those with power to maintain that power over those without it. And I will not allow those excuses to drag anyone else into bondage. When she finished speaking, he finished. The chambers were silent, the kind of silence that seemed to weight everything that had come before, that gave it gravity and importance. One of the elders, a man named Tormund, who represented the Western Peaks Pack, leaned forward, his weathered face serious and grave. "Corvus," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "do you deny these claims? Do you dispute the marks on her body? Do you claim the whipping scars are false?" Corvus's face had gone pale. "Ancient law," he began, his voice shaking with the effort of maintaining his authority in the face of testimony that seemed to have shifted something fundamental in the balance of power. "Ancient law was written by men," Tormund interrupted, his voice sharp with anger, the anger of someone who had just realized that a system he had tacitly accepted for years had been built on cruelty. "And men are capable of injustice. I have seen the marks on her wrists. I have heard her testimony. I have looked into her eyes and seen the truth there. And I am ashamed, deeply ashamed, that we have allowed this to continue in our territories, that we have permitted elders like you to hide behind claims of tradition and ancient custom to justify slavery and abuse. The Nightshade Pack's bondservant system is abolished. This is my ruling, and I put it forward to the full council." The vote was swift, almost shockingly swift. Only Corvus dissented, and his dissent meant nothing, carried no weight in the face of the other 4 elders voting in agreement. The council had spoken. The ancient law had been struck down. The system that had enslaved Omegas under the guise of tradition and natural order was no longer legal in the territories under the Alpha King's rule. But more than that, Corvus was stripped of his position. He was removed as elder of the Nightshade Pack, his authority revoked, his power scattered like ash on the wind. His voice would have no more weight in council chambers. His interpretations of law would be meaningless. He was nothing now, just an old man who had been caught in the act of justifying cruelty and found wanting by the very system he had served for so long. When it was done, Elowen felt something settle in her chest. Something that had been held tight since she was 17 finally released its grip. Justice was not her cause to carry anymore. The law had spoken. The system had been broken. The old justifications had been stripped away, and she was free. Fenris escorted her from the chambers, his hand at the small of her back, supporting but not controlling. "You were magnificent," he said quietly, and she could hear the genuine admiration in his voice, the kind of respect that went beyond courtesy and spoke to something real. "I have never seen the council move so decisively, and it was because of you, because of your courage in speaking your truth." "I was terrified," she admitted, the confession emerging without her having to think about it. "I know. And you did it anyway. That is what courage is." The fortress gardens were at their most beautiful in the full flush of spring. Everything was blooming, the apple trees laden with pink-tinged white flowers, their branches heavy with blossoms, the roses pushing through their climbing frames in shades of red and pink and white, the wildflowers scattered through the grass like a gift from the earth itself, dotting the green with colors that seemed impossible, too bright and vivid to be real. The spring had brought genuine warmth now, the kind that said the worst of winter was truly past, that the world had turned toward growth and renewal. The air itself seemed to shimmer with potential. Elowen had spent the weeks since the council hearing learning how to be simply Elowen Ashwood. Not a servant, not a property, not a thing defined by abuse. She had spent the weeks discovering herself, piece by piece, moment by moment. She had learned her own preferences. She liked the morning light and books and the smell of growing things. She had learned that her body could feel joy, that touch didn't always mean harm, that she could exist in her own skin without constantly bracing for a blow. She had started riding every day, exploring the territories that surrounded the fortress, testing the boundaries of her freedom and finding that they were real, that no one called her back, that the world did not collapse when she was not serving someone else's needs. Fenris had continued to give her space, to allow her to move at her own pace. But there was a tension building between them, a kind of pull that was not coercion but something almost magnetic, a call that came from their natures themselves, her wolf. The beast within her that had been dormant for so long, kept small and quiet by the shackles and the servitude, taught to be ashamed of its strength, was beginning to stir. It wanted to recognize the mate bond that had been ignited in the great hall of the Nightshade Pack. It wanted to bind itself to his, to create the permanent connection that true mates formed, that would merge their essences in a way that was both binding and liberating. And Elowen, the human woman, the person she had always been beneath the servant, was beginning to want it too. Not because she felt obligated, not because the bond was demanding it, but because she had learned who she was and who she wanted to be, and that person wanted to be bound to Fenris, freely and completely. It was she who suggested the garden walk on a golden afternoon, when the light fell through the apple blossoms like something sacred, when the air itself seemed to glow with the promise of renewal. They walked together through the paths lined with emerging spring flowers, their hands not quite touching, the space between them charged with the weight of things not yet said. "I think I'm ready," Elowen said finally, stopping beneath an apple tree heavy with pink-tinged blossoms that fell like snow with every breath of wind. "I think I've mourned enough. I think I've learned enough about myself. I think I've tested the boundaries of my freedom and found that they are real. And I think I want to know what it feels like to choose you. Not because you command it, not because the bond demands it, but because I choose it." Fenris turned to her, his gray eyes with their ring of burning gold searching her face. "Are you certain? This is not something that can be undone. Once a mate bond is sealed." "I know," she said. "I've thought about it. I've dreamed about it. And I don't want it undone. I want to know what it feels like to be bound to someone who sees me, who respects me, who gave me the space to choose. I want to be yours, and I want you to be mine, by my choice." He reached for her then, his large hand gentle as he cupped her face. He was still being careful, still asking permission with every motion. She answered by leaning into his touch, by closing her eyes and allowing herself to feel his warmth, to trust that this gentleness was real. When he kissed her, it was soft and deep, and she felt the bond between them blaze. The golden light that had first ignited in the great hall of the Nightshade Pack now burned like a sunrise, visible to anyone with the eyes to see it. It filled her with sensation, his taste, his warmth, the scent of leather and pine, and something that was purely him. It filled her with the knowledge that she was no longer alone, that she was part of something larger than herself, that she had chosen to be bound and was not diminished by that choosing. They sank down together into the soft grass beneath the apple tree, surrounded by fallen blossoms that seemed to rain down upon them like benediction, like the blessing of the spring itself on their union. When they shed their clothing, it was not with desperation or fear, but with the kind of tenderness that comes from true choice, from knowing that every touch is voluntary and wanted. She could see his scars, thin lines across his back from battles fought, small marks from years of living as a warrior, and she understood that his body too had been marked by the world, that strength and survival left their imprints on everyone. Every touch was a question, and every question was answered with yes, with eagerness, with the kind of pleasure that her body had been denied for so long that it seemed almost impossible that this could be real, that she could feel this much joy without it being followed by punishment. She had to relearn what pleasure was, that it could be safe, that it could be kind, that a man could touch her and not hurt her. His hands learned her slowly, careful of the scars that marked her past, reverent of the body that had survived so much. He traced the thin line on her collarbone as if it were precious, as if the survival it represented was something to honor. She learned him in turn, marveling at the strength she was allowed to touch, at the way his wolf's golden eyes would surface when pleasure overtook him, at the growl in his chest that was not aggression but joy, recognition, the animal acknowledgement of finding its mate. And when he made the final claim, sinking his teeth gently into her shoulder, marking her as his, while she marked him in turn, her teeth finding the curve of his neck, the bond snapped into place with a finality and a rightness that seemed to rewrite the fundamental structure of who she was. The mate bond was no longer something waiting to be claimed. It was real now, active, alive, pulsing with golden energy between them that seemed to light up the world. She could feel him in her mind, his consciousness touching hers, his emotions opening to her, his complete commitment to her safety and her freedom. And she gave him the same, opening herself entirely, trusting in a way she had not thought herself capable of. She was no longer Elowen Ashwood, the servant. She was Elowen Ravenspire, Alpha Queen, mate of the Alpha King, free and chosen and loved. They lay together in the grass beneath the apple tree as the afternoon light turned golden and then orange and then the purple gray of approaching dusk. The wildflowers grew all around them, pushing up from the earth with the kind of determination that had always reminded her that nothing broken stayed broken, that life always found a way to bloom again, that spring always came no matter how long and harsh the winter had been. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear water, a stream flowing through the valley carrying melted snow down from the mountains, life-giving and constant. "I was so afraid," she whispered into the hollow of his throat where his pulse beat strong and steady, "that if I chose you, if I let myself love you, that I would lose myself again, that I would become part of your power the way I had been part of the pack's cruelty." "Never," he said, his fingers running gently through her hair, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "You will never be part of anything that doesn't honor you. You will never be bound to anything but what you choose. And if you ever change your mind, if you ever need to leave, if you decide that this life is not what you want, I will not stop you. I will grieve, but I will not stop you. But I hope you won't need to leave. I hope you'll want to stay, the way I want to stay with you." "I'll stay," she said. "Not because I have to, but because I choose to. Every day. For as long as you'll have me, I choose you." And in the gardens of Ravenspire, in the spring where everything was being born anew, where the earth pushed up with green growth and wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors, a woman who had survived slavery and abuse and 7 years of dehumanization found herself whole again. Not because her past was erased or forgotten. The scars would always be there, thin white lines on her skin, permanent reminders of what she had endured and survived. The trauma would linger sometimes, moments when a raised voice or sudden movement would trigger the old fear response. But the bondage was broken, the chains were shattered, and she had been reborn in the spring garden, marked by his teeth and his love, forever changed. She had chosen to move beyond her past, to claim her own power, to bind herself to someone who saw that power and honored it rather than trying to diminish it. This was not submission. This was the strongest choice she could make. The golden light of the mate bond burned like a star fallen to earth, visible to anyone who passed through the gardens, a sign that true love was not about dominance, but about two complete people choosing to become something greater together, not through loss, but through union freely given, not through submission, but through the kind of strength that comes from choosing vulnerability with someone worthy of it. And Elowen, once a servant in chains, now an alpha queen in an emerald gown with gold thread at the seams, smiled up at the apple blossoms falling like snow around her, and she understood for the first time since she was 17 years old what it felt like to be truly, wholly free.